If you only looked at this week's manufacturing headlines, you would see that a chemical company is expanding in the US, a beverage company is investing in the fruit processing in the UK, a foundry entering aerospace and defense, and a steel producer modernizing one of its largest facilities. At first glance, these stories complete seems completely unrelated, but they are all answering the same question. Where is the manufacturing investment actually going in 2026? For years, manufacturers have invested where the production was cheapest or the efficiency was the highest. But today, that strategy is changing, and companies are putting billions into building production closer to the customers, strengthening the in supply chains, and modernizing critical facilities, and expanding into the industries backed by long-term demand. So this week, the four investments revealed that manufacturing is no longer been optimizing only for the cost. It's building strategic capacity. Now let's connect the dots. So the first story comes down from the Dow, which announced $100 million investment to expand silicone in manufacturing in the US. Now the obvious question is why invest in more silicone capacity now? Because silicone isn't just another industrial material. It is used in electric vehicles, electronics, renewable energy systems, healthcare products, in construction, aerospace, and advanced manufacturing. And the demand has been growing across the multiple high value industries at the same time. But expanding the domestic production, by expanding the domestic production, Dow isn't simply increasing their output, it's reducing dependence on the overseas supply by improving the delivery reliability and positioning itself closer to the customer in strategic industries. So this tells us something important, that manufacturers are no longer treating production capacity as a cost to minimize. They are treating it as a competitive advantage that improves resilience and protects future growth. By strategic investment, but the strategic investment isn't limited to advanced materials. The same shift is now reaching something much more familiar, our food supply chain. So Suntory Beverage and Food, Great Britain and Ireland is investing close to 14.5 million pounds in a new generation blackcurrant processing facility. At first glance, this will sound like a routine food manufacturing upgrade, but the real question is why spending millions on a local processing instead of simply importing from the more ingredients? So the answer is supply chain resilience. Because food manufacturers have experienced that years of disruption, from climate events and transportation delays to geopolitical uncertainty, relying on long international supply chains has become increasingly risky. And by investing in domestic processing capacity, Suntory gains greater control over quality and improves relationships with the local growers, which reduce the transportation risk and shortens the path from farm to the factory. So what's interesting is that this strategy mirrors what we are seeing in semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and industrial manufacturing, different industries but same investment philosophy. So strategic capacity isn't just about where companies manufacture, it's about what makes them choose to compete in, what markets they choose to compete in. So moving on to the third story, the Grainger and Worrall announced 30 million pounds expansion, accelerating its move into aerospace, defense, and energy. So the obvious question here is why move away from traditional automotive dependence? Because manufacturers are following where long-term demand is strongest, and aerospace, defense, and energy are attracting sustained investments from both the governments and private industry. And these sectors typically involve higher value products, longer production programs, and more stable order books than many traditional manufacturing markets. So rather than just waiting for one industry to recover, Grainger and Worrell is diversifying into sectors expected to remain strategic for years. So that's an increasingly common pattern across manufacturing. And companies aren't simply growing, they are repositioning themselves towards industries with stronger long term resilience. And finally, we arrive at one of the manufacturing oldest industries, steel. But even here, the investment story has changed. US Steel announced a $475 million investment to improve operations at one of its major facilities. Now, many people immediately ask, is this just replacing old equipment? Not really, because modern steel production today is about far more than maintenance, and manufacturers are investing in automation, operational efficiency, in product quality, energy performance, and production reliability. And modern facilities can produce higher value steel while remaining competitive against global producers. So this investment reflects a broader reality. Countries increasingly view steel as a strategic industrial infrastructure, and maintaining competitive domestic steel production supports construction, defense, transportation, and manufacturing ecosystem. So it's another example of how companies strengthening the industrial foundation rather than simply cutting the costs. Now let's connect all the four stories. Dow is expanding its production capacity. Suntory is strengthening domestic supply chains. Grainger and Worrall is repositioning into resilient industries, and US Steel is modernizing critical industrial infrastructure. Different companies, different industries, different countries, and yet they all are making remarkably similar decisions. For decades, manufacturers optimized around one objective: produced at the lowest possible cost. And that model isn't disappearing, but it's no longer enough. Today manufacturing leaders are asking different questions like, how resilient is our supply chain? Can we guarantee production during disruptions? Or are we positioned in industries with a long-term demand? Or do we control critical manufacturing capabilities? Can we respond faster than competitors? Now, these questions are increasingly shaping where the capital will flow. And manufacturing investments is becoming less about chasing the cheapest location and more about building capacity that will create a strategic advantage. So, the bigger takeaway that you can take from this story is the bigger story this week isn't that the four companies announced investments. It's that all four points in the same direction. Manufacturing is entering a period where resilience, capability, and strategic positioning are becoming just as important as efficiency. So the companies that are investing today aren't simply adding factories or upgrading their equipments. They are deciding where future industrial strength will be built. And if this trend continues, the manufacturers that win over the next decade won't necessarily be those with the lowest cost. They will be the ones with the strongest supply chains, the right market exposure, and the production capacity to adapt as the global demand continues to shift. So that's the real manufacturing story behind the week's headlines, this week's headline. And if you found this analysis useful, subscribe to the Industriqo. Every week, we connect the manufacturing stories that matter, explain the patterns behind them, and help you understand where global industry is heading next.